We must all hang together, or assuredly we shall all hang separately. Benjamin Franklin.
Oh, hi, Mr. Lahasky here, and today we're tasked with the monumental challenge of building a nation. Actually, I guess technically we're not, but that was certainly the position of the American colonists in 1776. After a long struggle with their British counterparts across the Atlantic, the Americans were quite literally staring down the barrel of the British Army. But that was really only a fraction of their problems. In order to sustain a rebellion, the Patriots would need to coordinate their efforts across the colonies. And in the event they were able to win the war, they would need a viable system of government to hold the new nation together. The birth of American democracy was no doubt a triumph, but it was not without its hiccups either. Today, we'll fight the war and take a stab at forming a government. But first, a big question. Was the American Revolutionary War revolutionary? The crux of this question is the definition of a revolution. Commonly, the word revolution is used to describe an overthrow of a government or political system. And by that definition, the War for American Independence certainly fits the bill. But in the social sciences, we prefer a narrower definition. By our standards, a revolution is a change, but not just any change, a fundamental change from which there is no going back. When human civilization first learned to cultivate food crops and developed agriculture, that was a revolution. When manufacturing was mechanized and industry took shape, that was a revolution. Does the birth of American democracy fit this standard? Let's take a look. The Revolutionary War began in April of 1775 with the battles of Lexington and Concord. The Americans declared independence over a year later on July 4th, 1776. The war lasted 8 long years, but for the sake of time, we'll be summing it up with a single big idea. The Americans were victorious in the Revolutionary War for 3 main reasons. They enjoyed important advantages at the war's outset, they benefited from the military leadership of George Washington, and they courted necessary assistance from European allies. Now, when the Revolutionary War is taught in most elementary schools, and often when it's discussed in social circles, it's pitched as a contest between David and Goliath. 13 puny colonies taking on the most powerful empire in the world and winning. In 1805, poet, novelist, and historian Mercy Otis Warren wrote one of the first histories of the Revolutionary War and cemented this interpretation in the minds of the American people. She wrote, "The British were indeed very far superior to the Americans in every respect necessary to military operations, except the revivified courage and resolution, the result of sudden success after despair." It's not hard to see why this narrative is a popular one. After all, everyone loves a good underdog story. And in some respects, Warren's correct. The British had significant manpower advantages from the beginning. Britain's population in 1776 was 8 million. Compare that to just 2.5 million in the colonies. The British Army in 1776 included 55,000 professional soldiers, while the Americans would be fighting only with their colonial militias and a crudely assembled Continental Army under the command of George Washington. The British Navy was one of the most powerful in the world in the 18th century, and the colonial navy, well, there wasn't one. Indeed, on first look, the British seemed to have things well at hand. But Warren's narrative ignores some important advantages that the Americans enjoyed. And those advantages would go a long way towards leveling out the playing field. Since the war was fought on American soil, the colonists benefited from a sort of home field advantage, since they were fighting on familiar terrain and had the support of the communities in which they campaigned. Also, the colonies covered a huge land area and had no true capital city. This allowed them to decentralize the war effort and force the British to campaign all over the continent. But the most important advantage enjoyed by the Americans was in terms of strategic objectives, or in other words, what each side had to accomplish in order to win the war. Since the British were fighting to maintain control of the colonies, it wasn't enough just to simply win engagements on the battlefield. They would need to defeat the colonial armies, conquer rebel territory, and then occupy the territory in order to continue to enforce British law. On the other hand, The Americans were fighting just to be left alone. They didn't need to win the war, they just had to not lose it. By keeping the fight alive, they could slowly wear down the British until the Crown lost interest or ran out of financial resources to continue. In this way, a longer war actually favored the colonists, as long as they could keep soldiers in the field. Simply put, the British would have to do far more in order to win this war. And so, on paper, the contest was closer than it may have first appeared. But of course, wars aren't won on paper. And at the risk of sounding cliche, the leadership of George Washington and others in the colonial ranks were a big reason why the Patriots ultimately were successful. In advance of the Battle of Trenton in 1776, Washington managed to keep his troops together during a brutal winter at Valley Forge. He had begged the Second Continental Congress for food and supplies, but the Congress had little power to raise the necessary funds. With 20% of his men shoeless, and a smallpox epidemic posing a bigger threat than the British Army, Washington's leadership shone. Here's a quick clip that can tell the story a little better than I can.
But first, Washington must face his greatest challenge as leader. He makes his winter camp in Pennsylvania, a place called Valley Forge. In freezing temperatures, the rebels build 900 huts in just 40 days. Each houses a dozen men.
He has an army of 14,000 men and no houses. And the Continental Congress has failed to provide him with resources. And by willpower, by courage, by leadership, by cajoling, he has to hold the army together in the middle of a terrible winter.
Joseph Plum Martin, veteran of the Battle of New York, is at Valley Forge. It's a desolate place.
We're now in a truly forlorn condition. No clothing, no provisions, and as disheartened as can be. Our prospect is indeed dreary.
Right, soldier. It's gonna hurt a bit, all right? You just grit your teeth.
Surgeon Albigence Waldo watches Washington's army head toward crisis.
The army, which has been surprisingly healthy, now begins to grow sickly from the fatigues they have suffered from this campaign. If we don't keep this clean, we're going to be right back in here.
A fifth of the soldiers have no shoes. With little clean water, dysentery spreads through the camp. Within weeks, 2,000 men are sick, and they run out of meat. Down to their last 25 barrels of flour, the men survive on fire cake, a mixture of flour and water. The rebel army is a melting pot. As many as 60% of recruits are convicts, freed slaves, and immigrants. But Washington's leadership inspires unruly men to stay in line.
What he had was a confidence that if you want freedom, this is what it's going to take. It's going to take sacrifice. It's going to take blood. It's going to take cold winters at Valley Forge. It's going to take losses.
General Washington, he was a great general to be able to uplift his army during Valley Forge during that winter and still be able to fight. I wish I would have been there. I wish I could have fought for him, because I damn sure would have.
But Washington's army soon faces an enemy far more lethal than the British. Smallpox. The revolution breaks out during the worst smallpox epidemic in U.S. history. The deadly airborne virus spreads through the British prison ships. Isolated from the disease for generations, the American colonists have little resistance to it, and there's no cure. Victims break out in blisters and sores. The virus spreads through the blood, invading healthy cells which it kills, producing more of the virus in the process. 4 in 10 victims die. Once smallpox arrives at Valley Forge, it spreads through the cramped huts like wildfire. Washington survived smallpox as a child. Now he decides to take a gamble with one of the most daring experiments in U.S. military history. Surgeons have learned about inoculation from African slaves. They harvest pus from a smallpox victim. And smear the live virus into cuts on the skin of a healthy patient. The inoculation spreads the infection, but at a slower rate. A week after exposure, the victim's white blood cells create antibodies. These attack and kill the virus that causes smallpox before the disease can spread. But it's a dangerous race against time. To survive, the patient's immune system has to work faster than the virus, or it'll run out of control. 1 in 50 of those inoculated will die. But Washington's gamble pays off. New cases of smallpox fall from several thousand to just a few dozen. But to win the war against the British, Washington turns to an unlikely hero to transform his ragtag militia into a formidable fighting machine. 1778. George Washington's Patriot Army survives a hard winter and an outbreak of smallpox at Valley Forge. Now, Washington introduces a new recruit who will change the course of the war. Baron von Steuben is an ex-Prussian army officer, an elite soldier whose career is said to have been ruined by his homosexuality. But Washington makes him one of the most powerful men in his command.
Washington was a genius in taking people in who didn't seem like they could achieve great things, but under him, they rose to the challenge, they rose to the occasion. And that's what great leaders do.
Von Steuben's task, reinvent the demoralized Patriot Army so they can take on the British in a close fight.
Capitalizing on the morale he was able to drum up in the Valley, Washington attempted a daring advance on Trenton, New Jersey in December 1776. He famously crossed the icy Delaware River on Christmas night before capturing a garrison of British mercenaries at Trenton the following day. Now, in a strategic sense, Trenton was but a small victory, but its effects were enormous. Tales of Washington's heroism inspired a renewed resolve across the colonies, and enlistments jumped dramatically in the coming months. Many historians have pointed out that Washington was not a brilliant tactician on the battlefield, but few have found just cause to question his leadership. But military leadership would not itself be enough to fully tip the scales for the American cause. Independence was the goal, but ironically, it could not be realized alone. The colonists needed help. Fortunately, Britain had European rivals who were eager to see the British Empire weakened, and an independent United States would do just that. In 1776, the Continental Congress sent Ben Franklin, John Adams, and others to Europe in order to secure alliances that could provide the ships, soldiers, and money that were desperately needed by the Continental Army. But while European countries may have been quietly cheering for an American victory, they were hesitant to commit their own countrymen to a foreign war in support of a nation that was so unproven. But the American diplomats caught a break in 1777 when the Continental Army won a huge battle at Saratoga, New York. The Battle of Saratoga was the first time the Americans had captured an entire British army in detail. And when the news of the battle reached Europe, it proved a major factor in convincing the French, Spanish, and Dutch that the United States had a fighting chance and would make for a worthy ally. Thanks in part to the victory at Saratoga, Ben Franklin successfully negotiated the Treaty of Alliance with France, which committed soldiers and ships to the American cause. Spain committed money and supplies to the colonial effort, and John Adams secured a much-needed loan from the Dutch. The Americans finally had the resources needed to tip the scales in their favor. The last major battle of the war came at Yorktown in 1781. The siege operation there forced the surrender of British General Charles Cornwallis. A peace treaty was still 2 years away, but Yorktown marked the end of major hostilities, and the American victory there made apparent the inevitability of independence. So let's talk about the terms of victory. The War for American Independence officially concluded with the Treaty of Paris, 1783. Remember not to confuse this with the 1763 version that ended the French and Indian War. The Treaty of Paris was negotiated largely by Ben Franklin and was quite favorable for the Americans. First, England formally recognized the independence of the United States. Second, the new nation received all lands east of the Mississippi River and south of the Great Lakes. The Proclamation Line of 1763 was of course eliminated, which was great for westbound settlers, but unwelcome news to the Native Americans who stood in their path. Finally, the British agreed to withdraw all troops stationed in the West with, quote, all convenient speed, though the withdrawal would be anything but speedy. But more on that later. All in all, the Americans had done it. With the help of France and Spain, they had upset the balance of power in the Western world and achieved their long sought-after freedom. But the real challenge was only just beginning. The position in which the Americans found themselves in 1783 is perhaps best articulated in this clip from Lin-Manuel Miranda's world-famous musical, Hamilton.
They say the price of my war's not a price that they're willing to pay. Insane! You cheat with the French, now I'm fighting with France and with Spain. I'm so blue. I thought that we made an arrangement when you went away. You were mine to subdue. Well, even despite our estrangement, I've got a small query for you. What comes next? You've been freed. Do you know how hard it is to lead? You're on your own. Awesome. Wow. Do you have a clue what happens now? Oceans rise, empires fall. It's much harder when it's all your call. All alone across the sea. When your people say they hate you, don't come crawling back to me. Da 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 ya da 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 ya da. You're on your own.
Beneath the quirkiness of Jonathan Groff's performance, there's actually incredible insight here. As the king points out, it's one thing to talk about freedom and democracy, and it may be easy to rally soldiers under the banner of freedom and democracy. But creating and implementing a government that sufficiently protects freedom and democracy, that's a whole nother animal. This was the new challenge, and one that was not so easily completed. This is our second big idea. The first government of the United States, the Articles of Confederation, reflected American notions of liberty by limiting governmental powers and avoiding the colonists' monarchical past. Okay, so technically, the first government of the United States was the Continental Congress, which oversaw the war effort from 1776 to 1781. But the Congress was never meant to be a permanent solution. its members recognized that the parameters for the permanent government needed to be explicitly laid out and agreed upon by the 13 member states. In 1777, while the war was still in its early stages, those parameters were outlined in the Articles of Confederation. The Articles formed the first rule book that defined American democracy and the powers of the U.S. government. One key observation about the Articles of Confederation: they established an American government that was almost cripplingly weak. But this was actually intentional. For many Americans, the Revolutionary War was not simply a rebellion against taxes. It was an overthrow of a tyrannical government, one that was ruled by a despot with unchecked power. Runaway government power and the infringement of liberty that accompanies it was the number one concern of our country's founders. As a result, they placed strict limits on the government's powers in the hopes of preventing the emergence of an American tyrant. The essence of the Articles was to tie the 13 independent states together very loosely. Most Americans identified more with their home state than with the national government, so this was a logical expectation. Americans didn't yet consider themselves Americans. They were Georgians, South Carolinians, Virginians, New Yorkers, and so on. Soldiers across the colonies had coordinated their efforts during the Revolutionary War, but they were fighting for the freedom of their home states. Newspapers didn't print "the United States," they said "these United States." A subtle difference, but an important one. Many Americans expected their state to do most of the governing, and the Articles reflected that. At the federal level, the Articles established a unicameral or one-house legislature, in which each state contributed one vote. In order to pass a law, 9 out of the 13 states needed to vote for it, and in order to amend the Articles, a unanimous vote was needed. These extremely high thresholds made it very difficult for the national government to get things done, which is the way the founders wanted it. It forced most of the governing to be done at the state level. Under the Articles of Confederation, there was to be no executive branch and no chief executive. This stems from the colonists' desire to avoid anything that reminded them of monarchy. The idea of putting a single person atop the federal government felt a little like crowning a king, a slippery slope to tyranny and one that the founders wanted no part of. The Articles also held that the federal government would be forbidden from taxing the people. Again, no real surprise here if we consider what the founders had been through. The Revolution was triggered by a slew of British taxes, so in their effort to distance themselves from their former overlords, they nixed the prospect of taxation altogether. Finally, the government under the Articles of Confederation could not draft soldiers into a standing army. This, of course, stems from the colonial troubles with the British Redcoats. The founders saw a large standing army as an instrument of tyranny, and for most of this country's history, Americans have been wary of a large military. This trend has really only reversed in the last half century or so. By establishing these strict limits on the federal government, the founders hoped to protect the freedoms that had underpinned the Revolutionary War. Thomas Paine once remarked, "That government is best which governs least." And certainly, the government under the Articles was governing least. Unfortunately, the Articles proved to be imperfect. And next time, we'll take a look at the successes and failures of the Articles of Confederation. For now, though, let's revisit the big question. Was the Revolutionary War revolutionary? On one hand, when Americans achieved independence, they experienced few fundamental changes in their day-to-day lives. If anything, American society probably felt like it did in 1753, on the eve of the French and Indian War. Furthermore, the new American government outlined by the Articles of Confederation left much of the governing to be done at local levels, which also represented a continuity from the era of salutary neglect. On the other hand, American democracy was a truly grand experiment, one that had never before been attempted on such a scale. The democratic reverberations that struck France and Latin America in the decades following the war with Great Britain suggest that the American colonists were on the leading edge of a global movement. Aside from a few holdouts, the great monarchies of the Old World have largely given way to democratic institutions. And all that started with the American Declaration of Independence. So perhaps, in a bit of irony, the American Revolution may not have been all that revolutionary for the United States and its people. But by defeating the British and legitimizing democracy in the eyes of the world, American independence may well have been a turning point in the history of civilization. Next time, we'll take a look at the successes and the shortcomings of the Articles of Confederation. We'll see that the challenges of maintaining a continental republic are such that sometimes you just need to start from scratch. See you then.